Hi, I'm Richard Campbell. Thanks for coming on tonight. I see what I see what you mean. Let me just mute. If I mute that, does it go away? How about that? Uh, this is a brand new talk. I have been doing a lot of history-related things. I've been working on a book on the history of .NET for some time, and my friend Jenny Enstrom asked me if I would do one specifically on Xamarin. And so I have been spending some time gathering all of my notes and reviewing some interviews and things to try and give you a whole spectrum of this. It's early morning for me. I'm from British Columbia, and so it's like 7 a.m. back home. So everybody there is just waking up. This is what my place looks like. My remote decides it's going to work or not, as the case may be. That's my house on the left and my neighbor's house on the right. It's about 6 in the morning on a Wednesday morning. So this is a recording. And Wednesday in my neighborhood is garbage day. And so we have nothing but forest behind us. We're in British Columbia. And so we always get visitors on garbage day. Until I put the camera up, I didn't realize it was every week, absolutely reliably. But yeah, this guy wanders through pretty consistently just to see if I put up my garbage early. There are consequences if I do, including a fine from the city. So it's not recommended. You don't put your garbage out early. And just for Jimmy, I also grabbed a clip off of the front door. So that's just the looking out into the street. But there's my front door, and we often have other kinds of visitors that come by as well. A little smaller. Some people say cuter, but not me. I wouldn't say cuter. I do like that he checks my window just to see if anybody's home first. Generally, we refer to these as trash pandas, and there's a group of them living in the ravine in behind the house. I make a lot of podcasts. Any .NET Rocks listeners? Oh yeah, a few here. Great. My friend Carl Franklin started .NET Rocks back in 2002, which predates the word podcast. We call it an internet audio talk show, and we've been interviewing luminaries in the .NET space for 20 years. I came on board as the co-host in episode 100. Yesterday, we published episode 1823 or 1832. I also make a show for IT professionals called Runners Radio. And for a brief interval from 2011 to 2014, we made another show called The Tablet Show, which is going to factor into this particular conversation as to why that show existed at all. It was for very particular reasons. But we wanted to talk about Mono and Xamarin. But if we're going to start it all the way to the beginning, we have to talk about Linux and, more importantly, GNOME. So in 99, a very young Miguel de Icaza, just freshly moved from Mexico, coming to the U.S., formed a company with his friend Nat Friedman, which they initially wanted to call Helix Code. And their goal was to make a graphics interface for Linux. They called GNOME. Now, they were unable to ultimately trademark Helix Code, so they soon changed the name. But at this time, it was still Helix Code. Now, right around that same time, in 2000, Microsoft was very busy on a bunch of things. One of them was they had just been declared a pernicious monopoly and were being ordered by the Department of Justice to break up into two companies, an operating system company and an everything else company. Now, we know that never happened, but this is the point where they've been told to, and now Steve Ballmer takes over as CEO and begins the negotiations to do what we would know as the consent decree to ultimately keep the company together. And part of that consent, how Microsoft's going to change, so you don't need to break them up, was to be a more open company. And one of the first volleys we saw out in the world was actually related to .NET. It was at the PDC in 2000. So this was one of Microsoft's big developer conferences. It was in Orlando. And this is the first time we heard about .NET, well before it shipped. They were talking about a new platform based on internet standards, including a brand new programming language. Microsoft had never made a language from scratch before. They normally implemented existing academic languages, ones like C++ and BASIC. Now they were making a brand new language called C#. And then part of this announcement in 2000 was they were publishing the specification of the language as an ECMA specification. And this is relevant to our story because a young Miguel de Icaza read that spec and said, "This is a cool language." Now, they had been working on GNOME for more than a year, and they'd been experimenting with different languages on how to build a good GUI for Linux. And they were trying lots of different kinds of languages like Python, Scheme. They weren't getting the performance that they needed. And so they thought perhaps an implementation of C# might be a better way to go. So Miguel had a very specific drive towards trying to make this work. And he would ultimately work with some other folks. And very early on in these efforts, folks like Reese Weatherly and Sarg Friedman, they started to try and reverse engineer what Microsoft was making in these prototype versions of .NET against the specification. The specifications were far from complete. And part of that was that they really weren't intending for anyone to implement the language. They were publishing specifications largely to show they were being more open and to show, what their intent to build was. But that's a very different thing from what it takes to write your own compiler. And so the folks that were working on it didn't have enough information, and they worked pretty hard to try to go further. By 2001, Helix is now called Ximian. So I had to invent a word in order to be able to get a trademark to actually get a brand out there. This is where they're going to build GNOME. And this is also right around the same time that our friend Steve Ballmer, now the shiny new CEO of Microsoft, in a press conference calls Linux a cancer, just to help everyone get along better, right? Now, really, he was referring to the nature of copy left licensing, GPL, and so forth. But it still was not a useful thing to say ultimately. But Microsoft had built their business on source code. They were one of the first companies to ever sell software and to only sell software. They got into hardware to some degree later. So they were pretty defensive about how to treat software, and the open source movement to them was quite threatening. They'll change their tune, but it'll take a little while. The first time we really see Miguel in the context of .NET is at the O'Reilly conference in 2001, and this is actually his bio photo from that conference. So I think he's like 27, and he's talking about implementing a Linux version of C# he was going to call Mono. Now, this kicked off quite a fuss in the Linux community. I mean, Big L was very popular in the Linux community. Here he was working with a Microsoft technology, and Microsoft was a pernicious monopoly that tried to destroy the industry, according to some folks. And at the same time, the Microsoft folks are a little suspicious of him because, he is a Linux person. So Miguel makes his life pretty hard balancing between these two things. And they're still trying to largely reverse engineer their way through an implementation of .NET, because the big concern is that Microsoft will go after you if you actually do this. It's all well and fine they publish the specifications, but not necessarily a happy thing. And so it'll take them a few years to actually get an implementation of .NET done. But they worked their way through it. There's some interesting periods in this early time where they had written a C# compiler that ran in Linux, but it wouldn't compile the code. It would parse the code successfully. And then they actually had, there was other folks that were running Windows instances on servers where you could pass the code calls up and it would execute it on Windows and tell you if it was valid or not. So they were sort of in the early stages of trying to work through, does this work reliably without ever actually having a Windows machine present, so they could be sure they weren't copying any of Microsoft's code. By 2003, Ximian is sold to Novell. Novell is building up a cadre of tools and capabilities around a Linux stack. They have SUSE Linux and a bunch of other products. And so adding Ximian to that for GNOME, and they support Mono at the same time, becomes the norm. So they now have a stable income. Novell is a big thriving company at that time. They're not big fans of Microsoft, but they're functional. And so Ximian merges into Novell and business goes on. Also in 2003, the PDC conference. So this was in October. It was in Los Angeles. This is the Professional Developers Conference. I know the graphic looks really nice. It's because I had a graphic artist redo the original, because the original was 320 by 200. It's 2003, right? There's no 1080p anything in 2003. So I had this remade, and I'm going to show you a little video clip from that conference. So this was an after party, and my friend Carl Franklin is actually playing in the background here, but they're playing to Miguel. Hopefully this is clear. 240p. It's 2003. And yes, Don Box actually sings the whole song as into the lyrics of Michelle, only trying to convince Miguel that he should quit Novell and come work for Microsoft. He doesn't, not yet, anyway. But the work continues. By 2004, they're going to have a working version of Mono. But it's not the only project that's going on at the time. A company in Denmark called Over the Edge Entertainment is starting to build out a set of libraries for building games for phones and other small devices. And they're also experimenting with different languages for their library. They play with Python and a few others. And they look at Mono and think that's going to perform better for writing games. So they reach out to Miguel and his team and say, would you help us with our gaming libraries, working it in Mono? This company will later be known as Unity. And they're actually very instrumental in a lot of the things that happen from here. Fast forward another year or two, by 2006, Novell and Microsoft actually signed a collaboration agreement, being very friendly, according to some folks. That's the CEO of Novell, alongside Steve Ballmer, the CEO of Microsoft. Shaking hands, this is when Microsoft actually buys $240 million worth of SUSE Linux licenses, so a nice windfall for Novell. And a big part of their agreement is a sort of mutual protection pact. They're not going to sue each other's customers over any patents. The Linux community, for the most part, was horrified by this whole thing. They thought it was an entire mistake. There's lots of controversy to whether there were violations to it. It was it very quickly devolved in the press, where Novell had one interpretation of the agreement they just signed versus Microsoft having an agreement. Nothing bad happened, actually. They didn't sue each other at any point, but it certainly didn't help the cause for the most part. We could explore how deep the controversy went, but they were trying to get along. However, you could debate how much goodwill there was actually involved in this. And then the iPhone showed up. So the iPhone changed everything, for better or worse, right? This was the standardization of the smartphone. I argue that the smartphones were more interesting before the iPhone came along. Before the iPhone, phones had slide-out keyboards and attachments and all kinds of fun stuff. But after the iPhone, everything's a slab of black glass. First iPhone was not a great phone. It was a good phone. It was only 2G. And initially, Steve Jobs said, if you're going to program for the iPhone, you're going to write for Safari. He had seen the future with HTML5. Remember, it's only 2007. HTML5 is still years away from ratification. And so he saw no reason to have an open programming model for the iPhone. That's really not how Apple does things. They're very much a walled garden kind of company. However, the industry did not agree. And very quickly, the phone was hacked, jailbroken. And so the opportunity to do programming against it was very interesting. And Over the Edge went to the Mono team and said, hey, is there any chance you could help implement Mono against iOS? Now, Miguel didn't think that going against a jailbroke phone was all that smart, but neither did Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs quickly figured out, hey, we've got to solve this problem. And the answer was open up the internal development tools, Cocoa and Xcode and so forth, and create the store, so that there would be a mechanism to write code for the iPhone and then distribute it through a store with a 30% margin on it. But that also legitimized opportunities to do programming against it. And so the Mono team went to work on doing an iOS implementation for Over the Edge specifically. And Over the Edge by 2007 is now called Unity, and they are using Mono for iOS. Now, at this point, Mono for iOS is very much implemented just for the game engine, but they do have it in their mind now. Let's implement it against all the base APIs of the iPhone. And by 2008, at the PDC conference in Los Angeles, Miguel demonstrates a working version of C# running on an iPhone and blows all our minds. Right? Now, that was not the only stack out there that was going to be able to run on an array of devices. They've got the native APIs working. They're talking about doing other devices. Microsoft is also pretty active in 2008. They have a new cross-platform technology. They call it Silverlight. Now, the first version of Silverlight, this is going back to 2006 and 2007, had nothing to do with .NET. It was scripted with JavaScript. And in fact, its initial focus was as a media player. They were making a product for Netflix. At this time, Netflix is largely in the business of shipping you DVDs in red envelopes that you then ship back, and they want to get into streaming. But the problem is that bandwidth is not that good. And so they need a player that's capable of detecting how much bandwidth is available at a given time and changing the resolution of the video on the fly. So you're pre-encoding a given movie in multiple resolutions, and then you expect the player and the server to talk to each other to know what they can play for you reliably. And that was what Silverlight started out as, was a smart media player. It would evolve for a variety of reasons, right? Part of that being the failure of Vista and them having to push all of this stuff into .NET, the things like XAML and WCF. But as cool as Silverlight was, Microsoft also recognized there's a good reason to have it run on even more platforms, not just Mac and PC. And so they financially support the Mono team to make a version of Silverlight for Mono called Moonlight. So there was a relationship going there, and they're building that product. The gold rush of the iPhone is hard to overstate. By 2008, 2009, the drive to make applications for the most successful smartphone in the world at the time is massive, and many companies jump on board to build tools. One of the most important ones was Adobe with their product called Air. And the Air is essentially Flash outside of the browser. It's ActionScript and all the same elements. Still a product available today to allow you to build applications that run cross-platform. But I would be remiss not to mention things like PhoneGap, Corona, the Mono team was doing as well. It was a variety of products all trying to build onto this platform. By 2009, the Xamarin's got his act together, and they release a full version of MonoTouch for iPhone. You write C# apps. It's $400 a seat to own MonoTouch at the time. In 2010, the big iPhone arrives. Now, 2010 is a busy year. It's kind of staggering how many things happen in 2010. This is when Studio 2010 comes out, and we get Silverlight 4, which has got the out-of-browser operator, and it's kind of grown up, and it's supposed to be the definitive way to build enterprise applications by Microsoft. But this is also when the iPad is launched. Shortly thereafter, Steve Jobs puts out a letter called Thoughts on Flash. And that letter, he essentially says, listen, Flash is a pig. And look, Flash was a very early technology. It had been evolved for desktop PCs to provide automation into browsers. It was never meant for mobile devices, and it consumed a lot of energy. You could watch your iPad battery drain running a Flash app. And so, although the letter is more articulate than that, it really says the plugin is a security vulnerability, which is true. I mean, again, we forget in 2010, all of us as technical people were used to going to our respective family members' homes every holiday and replacing their address bars. Because at some point over the course of the year, every single person had clicked on some plugin that had swapped out the address bar for some kind of malware. Plugins are bad. Steve wasn't wrong, and killing the plugin was a good way to fix that problem, but it did also effectively kill Flash and Silverlight on iOS. The beginning of all of those problems. At the same time, within a few days of Thoughts on Flash, was a change to the developers agreement for iOS. And that agreement now said that any app to be submitted to the store so that it can be distributed on the iPhone or the iPad must be written in Objective C, C++, or JavaScript running on WebKit. This put a pretty big chill on the marketplace. Like, it's kind of a big deal. All these different products now have been built to try and build iPhone apps, and now suddenly Apple's saying, nope, it's only our programming tools you could use, essentially. But it was never enforced. It was just a scary moment in the spring of 2010 where everybody was waiting to see, there's a whole bunch of apps already in the store. Are they going to start pulling them? Nope, never did. Now, I've heard of doing the research on this that the U.S. Federal Trade Commission started calling some of the companies involved saying, hey, have you been impacted by this declaration by Apple in any way? Which, admittedly, at that time, nobody had. But it makes me wonder if at some point Apple realized, man, look at what they just did to Microsoft. Maybe we should. Anyway, the clause went away within a couple of months. But briefly in 2010, everybody was very scared about whether or not this programming was going to continue. The program was going to continue. So nobody ultimately stopped. The different tool sets were there. More apps get built. The store becomes its own crisis. Turns out having 1 million apps in your app store is just as big a problem as having no apps in your app store. You only need so many iFart apps in your life. And I would be also remiss to mention, this is when WinPhone starts. WinPhone 7 was announced in February of 2010, before all that mayhem, ships by the end of 2010. November of 2010, we get the first set of phones. And the programming model for that phone is a modified version of Silverlight. They've stripped it down enough to run it inside the phone, which also begs the question. The Mono folks were very aware of this. There was no reason at all that Silverlight couldn't have been implemented for iOS and Android for that matter. So it was one of those programming models where the base kits were simple enough it could have pretty much run on any device. They demonstrated it by running on these phones. All right. But also in 2011, Mono for Android. So I've saw a couple of slide decks from the time where they called it MonoDroid. Never stuck. So Mono for Android. So now the Xamarin team has C# running on iOS and Android. Most of that code runs very well into the WinPhone as well. So you've got a pretty good standardized programming platform there. It's $400 a machine per user. So if you want Mono for Android, it's another license. They're separate, but you can have both. Also in 2011, Attachmate buys Novell. It's a reverse buyout. Attachmate is a small company with good financing. They buy Novell, which is a publicly listed company, to take it private. And along the way, they're heavily leveraged to be able to do this buyout to delist them. So all assets are important and sort of protected while they're assessing the acquisition. But they see that there's not a lot of revenue coming from Mono. So they basically tell Miguel, hey, while we're doing this, you should lay off your whole team and yourself. And Miguel didn't think that was a good idea, but there wasn't much he could do about it. So he's now trying to figure out how to stand up a new company. And after he lays everyone off, he also says, you've got a good severance. Please give me a couple of weeks here. Just see if I can pull something off, because I'll hire you back if I can. And he's on the phone with his friend Nat Friedman, who had left the Xamarin early years before, and they're trying to figure out a way to set up a new company, get some funding, and to buy Mono. And ultimately, they are not able to buy Mono. They are able to raise nearly $1 million between friends and family, some other opportunities, and they get a license for Mono to be able to continue development on it. And in fact, in the end, what Attachmate agreed to is, we will license Mono to you indefinitely if you will do the tech support for it. Because as the word came down that Mono was being shut down, all these companies that were depending on Mono were on the phone to Novell going, what are you doing? Including Microsoft. Remember, Microsoft had made that investment in 2006. That had a bunch of responsibilities related to Mono on it. So they'd been helping to pay for Moonlight and some other pieces. So they're like, hey, you don't get to just shut it down. Like, you have some obligations here. And that created enough pressure for Attachmate to agree to spin those things off. Nat Friedman came back into the fold with Miguel, and they formed Xamarin. So 2010, 2011, frantic year. Just so much goes on to spin out into Xamarin. And now they're sitting as a standalone startup company. Within a year, they'll raise $12 million in their first seed round to run a company to do mobile development purely in the C# stack. So they've got the pieces. Now they've got to grow, get more users, expand. Microsoft is having its own excitement in 2011, and that excitement comes in the form of Build. So now it's a year and a half after the the iPad shipped, and Microsoft has their response. They're going to make a tablet version of Windows called Windows 8. They've also recognized that since there's no way to run their own development tools on iOS devices, the only lingua franca is JavaScript. And so they're going to focus on JavaScript development everywhere, including building a set of libraries for JavaScript developers to control Windows called WinJS. This all rolls out in Anaheim in 2011. Now, I make a podcast called .NET Rocks. And it's 2011, and I've just been to the Professional Developers Conference. There's no .NET sessions at it. And I said to Carl, what if .NET doesn't rock? And so by November, just a couple months later, we stood up the tablet show. Now, I already had problem with tablet content as it was. Lots of developers wanted to learn more about tablet development. They were very interested. Xamarin was a fascinating topic, and it normally didn't fit into the .NET umbrella. I've learned to expand that concept more now. Let's face it, it's a show for .NET developers, and .NET developers do mobile development in a lot of different flavors. Some JavaScript, some C#, it doesn't really matter. But for a period, we had a show called The Tablet Show every week, focused on tablet-related development topics, and it was our contingency for what we were afraid was the demise of .NET. We weren't alone. One of Xamarin's missions, they were afraid that .NET was going to die as well, so they were building up contingencies to be prepared to be the only people taking care of .NET at the time. Remember, this is also the point where Anders Hallsberg steps away from C# to go work on a secret project that we'll eventually learn is TypeScript. But at the time, he just sort of disappeared on us. So even on the show, I said, I feel like the keeper of C# actually doesn't work for Microsoft. It's a Linux guy named Miguel de Icaza. But we knew it didn't go that way ultimately. Within it, by the next year at the Build in 2012, back up in Redmond, Windows 8 comes out, WinJS is released, but the vast majority of the applications in the Windows App Store are C# and XAML. We may not have gotten a lot of love in that time as .NET developers, but we still got a lot of work done. And even if the Win 8 wasn't keen on running a lot of stuff in .NET, they gave us a path to do so, and we made a ton of apps. We were still a working bunch. Not a whole lot of WinJS action at that time. And Win 8, not all that popular. Didn't go particularly well. And so pretty quickly, the tide changes inside of Microsoft that they rapidly produce an update to Windows 8 called 8.1, clean up some problems, make it a little bit easier to use. For us Visual Studio folks, we got in Visual Studio 2012, which most people remember as a version of Visual Studio where all the menus were all caps, and that was very offensive. So by 2013, they would remove the all caps feature, which is the important thing to fix, but also that they would tune up and tailor a bit more for doing more traditional development. They would back away from the tablet story to some degree. Around that time, the Xamarin folks acquire a company. They're now a startup. They've raised some money. They get a second round, $16 million, and they buy a company called Less Painful out of Denmark. This is in 2013, and they are a mobile app testing company. They have a great distributed system for testing at large scale. They would soon be renamed the Xamarin Test Cloud, which, by the way, still exists today. It's just now called the Visual Studio App Center. But this was a place where for a fee, you could push your app up and literally get video clips of it running on all kinds of different form factor devices. They just had racks and racks and racks of various phones and tablets and things with cameras aimed at them. And so you could really run your app simultaneously on 300 or 400 different devices and see how it behaved and then watch the playbacks. It was cool. And they were a growing company. They were doing their best. Microsoft transforms it by build of 2014. The new CEO is in place, Satya Nadella. He came on board in February. This is the happy open source build in 2014. This is when they announced that Windows was free for devices under 9-inch screens or smaller. Windows free. They renamed Azure from Windows Azure to Microsoft Azure. They created the .NET Foundation. They open sourced Roslyn, the C# compiler as a service, and also announced it as cross-platform and living on GitHub. They moved off of Codeplex. Everything was living on GitHub. And many of us thought this was when they were going to announce buying Xamarin. I remember being in the crowd there and watching this event. It's like, they're gonna buy Xamarin, right? Like, of course they're gonna buy Xamarin. Like, they didn't buy Xamarin. Xamarin was a founding member of the .NET Foundation. A bunch of Xamarin code went into the foundation, but they did not acquire Xamarin at the time. There were attempts. Apparently, negotiations going on behind the scenes. It didn't work out, and so it didn't happen in 2014. Xamarin now, in late 2014, raises their largest block of money. So they had an A and a B round of like 12 million and 16 million. Now they take 50 million. That's a lot of money. You don't take 50 million because you're going to be rapidly acquired. In fact, now you're thinking you're not going to be acquired. So what you should do is get ready to go public. So you need enough money to flesh yourself out enough to be a standalone company that can be publicly listed. So this big C round was sort of a signal of we're going big. It also meant that they changed their acquisition strategies. They started looking at other things they were targeting in different kinds of companies. Also in 2014, .NET Core gets announced. That Microsoft says, all right, we're going to make an open source version of .NET. Rather than try and fix the one we've got, we're going to rewrite it. It's easier. The licensing is simpler. We're going to go from scratch. They have a core code base to work from. It's largely Silverlight, although they'll end up replacing a lot of that code. And it will take a long time, about 18 months from announcement to V1. And part of that is they're also learning to develop on GitHub. So it's part of the challenge there. Meantime, Xamarin's actually going in a different direction. Xamarin is now looking at Java. And in early 2015, they acquire a company out of Sweden called RoboVM that had built a Java for iOS implementation. So now Xamarin's put together a package where if you prefer to program in C#, you prefer to program in Java, you can go to either device. So common code bases in any language. They start working closely with different Java companies. They even start looking at an implementation to see if they could implement Swift for Android. So just trying to build up a set of languages that work cross-platform on all devices. Right? This is what a big company that's going to go public is going to be able to do. Also in 2015, we get Visual Studio 2015, kind of a definitive version. It's also when Win 10 shows up, which kind of puts all the Win 8 stuff to bed. Everybody loves Windows 10, although Microsoft's tackling Win 10 a different way. They said this is the last version of Windows. They were wrong, but they're going to keep pushing out updates much faster than anybody wants them. Both the Windows team and Windows users don't want Windows to be as updated as quickly as they're doing it, but they do it anyway. Also in 2015, Visual Studio Code. So TypeScript had been a hit with Anders Hallsberg, that the open source community really liked it. And it was a surprise for Microsoft. Microsoft was used to being hated by the open source community, and for some good reasons. But it turned out if they made a really good thing, the open source community would embrace it. And that happened with TypeScript by surprise. And so now they did it more intentionally. They said, let's make a great editor. We'll use Electron, and let's make an editor that everybody can love. And they succeeded. Visual Studio Code is the most popular editor in the world today. But it didn't take very long for it to be very successful. So remember how they were going to be a very big public company? December of 2015, a bunch of conversations happened in rapid fire inside of Microsoft. So that by December 31st, 2015. They only just raised the money a few months before. By December 31st, they've got an agreement in principle for the acquisition of Xamarin. Then starts a period of due diligence because there's so much code inside of this company and they need to know who owns it, what code's been used where. They're trying to clarify, they're finding code that Xamarin's got that looks like their code, but is showing up in other open source projects. So then they have to prove lineage to say, actually, the Xamarin code's the older code. Those guys are copying us. That all of that needs to be ratified before they can actually do the acquisition. And they get it done in a month. And by February of 2016, Xamarin is acquired by Microsoft. Now, the actual figure was never announced. The current guess, if you go poke around on the VC sites, it was probably somewhere between $400 and $500 million for what was 5 years of investment of about 80 million. So 5 times return on the money. It's good to be a VC. And our friends probably did just fine by that too. I know nothing about any of that. Miguel becomes a distinguished engineer inside of Microsoft. Nat Friedman becomes a VP. They go different ways inside of the company very quickly. It's about 400 people at that time working for Xamarin. They get, for the most part, moved into the company. Some folks don't come along, some do. And now we have a new phase to deal with. We're in a very different space now. They're now part of Microsoft. How do you integrate all of this? How do you rationalize the various flavors? Now, this is also follow-up from Windows 8. There is a lot of fragmentation in development tools inside of Microsoft, not really visible to us. But for the folks on the inside, there were different flavors of XAML. There was the version that we call WPF. There was the version that they'd implemented for Windows 8 that wasn't involving .NET at all. There was the version that went into Windows Phone that they were now going to abandon. And they now owned Xamarin as well. But even before they tackled that, they had the same problem with .NET. And it's in 2016 that we first see this idea of called the .NET standard. Now, again, for the most part, presenting out in the world, this was about getting vendors and so forth to all standardize on .NET. But it was also true inside of Microsoft. There were multiple implementations of .NET that lived inside of Microsoft, and they're trying to get them all to rationalize, to act the same so the code can work across them. And so they were splitting out what are the different pieces in the standard framework versus what's going to become part of .NET Core, because it's starting to put out versions as well, versus what Xamarin actually implements, because they have Mono in their own implementation of .NET. So we should at least have all the names match up. And it takes a few years. They make of several different iterations of .NET Standard, and it will succeed. By 2020, they will have a pretty much ratified Standard 2.1. So now, we've got that figured out. Let's try doing it with XAML too. So for a brief period, they talked about XAML standard. The question is, when you say XAML standard, what are you talking about? When you're talking about standardizing .NET, you are talking about a bunch of APIs, base class libraries, type systems, so forth. Like, it's very clear everything that should be in the .NET standard. But in XAML, not so much. Obviously, the tags should be the same. Right? The basic constructs in XML, they ought to be the same. But you can't necessarily implement all the APIs the same. You're dealing with different devices. And under the hood, they're different, and there's nothing you can do about it. And in fact, it's in your best interest to support multiple implementations against that device, depending on what you're doing. So standardizing is just not that simple of a process. Now, the big XAML players inside of Microsoft at this time are Xamarin, the Windows team with their flavor that's we call UWP and ultimately WinUI, and Windows Presentation Foundation, WPF, recognizing that Silverlight and mobile largely are gone now, and they were also different flavors of XAML. So there's a bunch of ways to try and tackle that unification. One aspect would be from a technical perspective. Arguably, the simplest set of classes would be the Xamarin classes, because they're the ones that work with mobile devices. They should be able to scale up to any device. Trying to come down from a Windows implementation into mobile, much more difficult thing to do. But rarely are technical decisions made purely on a technical basis. There are other bases to make too. How about market share? How many seats are actually using Xamarin versus seats using WPF versus seats using UWP? So it's a difficult set of decisions, and everybody's in motion. WPF has its own set of problems and its own set of customers that are changing and demanding new things. The Windows team living in Windows 10 LM with rapid iteration is having their own problems with trying to update their UI, where the only way you get to use those new UI features if you're a UWP developer is to convince your company to deploy a new version of Windows 10, which, having been an IT guy, seems unlikely, right? I tended to have a sign on my door that said, "No, any questions?" Uh, Updating Windows just because you want a new UX thing, not a good idea. So WinUI had a problem. We talked about this on .NET Rocks a fair bit, because WinUI was very cool. It was beautiful. UWP apps were neat. They were just different from everything else. And you needed to resonate Windows with it, which was problematic. So eventually WinUI moved out. They stopped tying it as closely to Windows. A, the Windows team wanted to slow down iterations anyway. Everybody was asking them to. And B, it just didn't make a whole lot of sense. Plus, the .NET Core folks had gotten up to .NET Core 3.1. And in 3.1, we had this idea of platform-specific SDKs. This is when we got WinForms and WPF for Core. They just weren't part of Core directly. They were a set of SDKs that sat beside it. This is 2019. And so it made, then you could see this is a place that WinUI could live. I'm not saying they happily went there, but they were capable. There was clearly a spot where that's also where WinUI could live. So it started to give a shape to how do we move these relationships around to try and build a unified stack. Now, we'd had more success by .NET 5. We largely are at the end of the .NET Standard initiative. .NET 5 was the point where we said, okay, now there's just one .NET. It's .NET 5. We have a legacy version in what you might call standard or 4.8, but everything else going forward is 5, 6. We're going to release them annually every November, starting in 2020. They've hit it every time now. So 5 in 2020, 6 in 2021, 7 in 2022, 8 in 2023. And we still have to fit Xamarin into this. And in that outline, they are talking about things like Unity and XAML for mobile and so forth. So from a .NET perspective, they've kind of got it wired in. But the push is now on for .NET 6 and a unified UX stack. This is when they first start using the term MAUI, right? The multiple application UI. And we're supposed to have all of those pieces in together. Now, the problem is that the code bases are disparate. On the show, going back, listening to some of the shows I did in .NET Rocks, we talked about MAUI being late. It was supposed to ship with .NET 6. But in order for it to work correctly, a bunch of things needed to be done that only got done by .NET 6, like the unification of the base class libraries. Mono had a set of base class libraries. .NET had a set of base class libraries. They were not the same. .NET 6 is when they finally came together. Like, you kind of can't build MAUI at all until that's done. So I don't know how they were supposed to ship MAUI in November of 2021 with .NET 6 when they only got that. And the guy who worked on it standing in the back of the room, so he got a big grin from him, because I used to harass him endlessly about how late they were, until I finally put the math together for this talk and said, oh, so there was no way to do this. Gee, I wonder why you were late. And in reality, they did get it done, right? By 2022 around May, we get our first full release of MAUI. So we're very current, very, very current now. And they got into step with 7. So as soon as they got done in May, well, actually before they got done with the 6 implementation in May, they were already working on a 7 implementation. And this past November, they updated the .NET 7 version of MAUI came out with .NET 7. So they're in cadence now. But it is still early days. And it is a unification of all of these different stacks. When you build against MAUI and you render to Windows, it's WinUI under the hood. When you build against Android, you're using a flavor of Xamarin that's now been morphed somewhat, but there's much more of the code base in common across the board. The base class libraries, type system, the actual instance of .NET, they're all the same. So we've kind of gotten there. We're just finally winning in the sense of this is what we meant to do all along, even if we didn't necessarily know that was the destination at the time. Which begs the question, what comes next? It's fascinating to me, as someone who's been involved since the very beginning, to imagine a tool set that I got excited about 23 years ago. I mean, it's madness that we're still using it, even though it has transformed several times. You know, I got into Visual Basic when it first started in 91, but Visual Basic beginning to end was 8 years. Not 91 to 99, done. Then it was .NET. 23 years. And we got a brand new library last year, an important one that rethinks the way we're going to do client-side development. And that to me is powerful. That's not a 23-year-old system. That's a system that's been around a long time, been able to build up on a set of tools and keep innovating. I'm excited to see what comes after that. Thanks so much for your time.
Much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. We do actually have some questions for you.
Cool.
Nice. And also super interesting seeing whole history. How many let's see, we have a question before that. How many apps are built with MAUI published to the Apple Store and Google Play Store? Do you have any idea of that?
I have no idea.
No.
That's great. David, would you know? Do you have any visibility of that? No? They exist.
Yeah,
right?
David says he doesn't have a count either.
Yeah.
He just knows they exist. And we know for sure that Daniel, our co-organizer, at least has one. Is Flutter for 2023, they said over 700K app build with
Wow.
Flutter, sorry. So I wonder if we need to choose between MAUI and Flutter and what framework is most wanted.
Well, I think Flutter has a head start. I think they're very good. There's no, you guys are smart. Make no bones about it. By the way, a lot of the Flutter people, ex-Microsofties. Looking at you, Tim Sneath, wherever you are. And they started from scratch. They were very fortunate, and there's very few opportunities you actually get a greenfield. Okay, what if you were going to build a dev stack for iOS and Android from scratch? The platform's already out there. You don't have any baggage except you're going to bring Dart with you for some reason. I don't have any problem with the Dart language. It's fine. And so that they've done a good job, and we've had them on the show, and and their latest version where they're starting to do Mac OS and Windows as well. Pretty exciting. That's cool. Why would you look at MAUI over Flutter? You like C#. You have code that already exists in XAML. You have libraries you already depend on. You have a group of developers who know this tool space better. They know how to function in Visual Studio. And so you have a commitment to the space, and carrying that code along is worthwhile. The same way that Microsoft did. The easiest thing in the world is to throw everything away and start over. What's hard is living with the things you've done in the past and giving people a bridge forward. There's one thing I've learned working with Microsoft for decades. They tend not to leave developers behind. They give us a path. So the work you've done before can be carried into these new models. And MAUI carries that tradition on. It's not a fresh start. It is all of the best of what we had, plus some new capabilities.
We do have a question. Does Microsoft use MAUI for their own apps? And Lucas was kind enough to say that in the beginning of our live, David actually showed some published and Microsoft applications that used MAUI. So we can confirm that.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's also an important aspect of Microsoft. I pay very close attention to what tools they use themselves on their stuff. Because if they don't, that's a red flag, right? And I looking at you, WPF, for many years after WPF was released, there were no Microsoft products. The first Microsoft product to implement WPF was Visual Studio 2010. That was 4 years after the initial release of WPF. I think, and it hurt the product to go that long. The transformation of WPF in WPF 4, which is the version they put out after Studio, was because the Studio team beat the snot out of it. APIs get better when big apps come to town and push on them hard. So the fact that we're seeing MAUI apps being built internally means we expect MAUI to get better. Those guys know where the MAUI devs live. They'll hunt you down. They're going to get stuff fixed, and we're all going to benefit from it.
Do we have any questions from the room? Yes, awesome.
Yeah, I think it was your previous slide. You saw these different platforms. Windows
the MAUI slide?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And my question is, what about Linux? Will it work for Linux, or is it not of interest for Microsoft to do that.
Well, the problem that Linux has got is what's its GUI, which I find fascinating. That Xamarin starts making a GUI for Linux. So, in theory, and you see some open source stuff going on in the space with the SDKs and things. You could see implementations against KDE or GTK, the different kinds of GUIs that Linux has. But there's nothing Microsoft's building directly that I know of. I don't know. Again, I'll defer to David since he's the back of the room there.
There is a Linux fork of the MAUI repo, and it runs basically. So you can find that on Javier Suarez Ruiz's GitHub. He's one of our core engineers. In terms of official plans to take it to Linux, it's in consideration, but it's not committed on the roadmap. So we do have actual business need. Remember WinCE?
Yep.
Yeah. So they have all these embedded systems out there. They can't build modern stuff for it. So they want, hey, can we use Linux? Seems like a good fit. So I think that would be an interesting scenario for us. So it's possible. If you have a business case for it or a personal case for it, I would love to know how you want to use it.
Thanks, David.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? No. In that case, we want to thank our sponsors, Progress Telerik, for making this possible, and Microsoft Reactor for actually hosting us, and for our amazing speakers. Thank you so much. The videos will be cut up and put on our YouTube Live. Thank you so much.